the relationship between India and Japan has changed dramatically over the past 2 decades. I'd like to emphasize again that Japan must strengthen its relationship with India further because India's importance in the world will only increase in the next 2 decades.
In terms of economic growth, India with its young population and Japan with its super-aged society are in a complementary relationship.
Hello and welcome to a special talk event on international affairs related to Japan. Today's theme is the Japan-India relationship, where it's going, why it matters, and what we can do to strengthen it. I'm Jonathan Sobel, former Tokyo bureau chief at the Financial Times, currently a partner at CREAB Japan, a strategic communications company here in Tokyo. My co-host today is Professor Hirose Hiromi. He's at Kindai University in Osaka, and he's also a former journalist. After graduating from the University of Tokyo, he joined NHK, Japan's public broadcaster, where he served as the chief correspondent in New Delhi, as well as the chief producer for NHK World Japan. At Kindai, he promotes education and research related to India, and is one of the leading figures in Indian studies in Japan. So it's great to be sharing this event with you today, Professor Hirose.
Thank you for a good introduction. I'm honored to have been invited to this occasion today. I just returned from a trip to India, and I was reminded again that India is growing, the change constantly, and is being reborn.
Thank you, Professor. And our special guest today is Associate Professor Kiyota Tomoko, and she's at Nagasaki University. Professor Kiyota is an expert on Indian defense policy and the India-Japan relationship. She got her PhD in security studies at Takushoku University. She's done fellowships at prominent Indian think tanks, as well as at Japanese embassies in India and in Thailand. And at Nagasaki, she's also continuing research into the India-Japan relationship and security, especially with a focus on security. It's great to have you with us today, Professor. Looking forward to hearing your comments on the relationship.
Thank you so much, Professor Hirose and Jonathan, for your kind introduction. I'd like to thank the organizer of the event, CREAB Japan too. So since Nagasaki University established the Research Center for Global Risk in June 2024, I have recently been focusing my research on India as a global risk. During my PhD, I have studied how India prepares for its own security, but now I'm analyzing what kind of global risk India poses, especially in terms of geopolitics and security.
Great. Professor Hirose, I know that you are a big supporter of Dr. Kiyota's work. Could you tell us a little bit about what makes it unique and important right now?
I really admire her work because the security environment in India has changed very fast, and it is very difficult to get a good grasp of the nature of India's security.
That brings us, I think, to a first question I'd like to ask, which is really, especially for readers or viewers who are maybe not directly involved in diplomacy between India and Japan. I mean, could you tell us, Professor Hirose, why this relationship matters and why the world should be paying attention?
Okay, the relation between India and Japan is important because India-Japan relations have great political and social and economic potential, and also it is also important to avoid the risk of this unstable world.
Yes, I mean, here we have on the one hand, the world's most populous country and, one of the world's biggest economies, and, same with Japan in terms of economic size, two democracies in Asia, two pivot points, I think, with other important countries in the region, including the United States and China. I'm looking forward to getting into all of that as we proceed today. So let's turn back to Dr. Kiyota. Can you give us a little bit of a snapshot on the India-Japan relationship, let's say over the past, decade or two?
So Japan-India relations have developed rapidly since former Prime Minister Modi's visit to India in 2000. In particular, since the joint declaration on security cooperation between Japan and India issued in October 2008, security cooperation has driven Japan-India relations more than economic and people-to-people exchanges. The declaration listed a variety of cooperation items, including information exchange, defense dialogue, fight against terrorism, and disaster management, most of which have been achieved over the past 16 years, which is remarkable. So during the 2+2 dialogue held last August, the two countries agreed to update this declaration. I really look forward to seeing what kind of cooperation the two countries will pursue in the future.
And what do you think is the reason why Japan-India relationship, the developments have accelerated so much in the last 16 years, as you say?
Yeah, personally, I think the presence of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was significant. In 2007, he gave a speech in the Indian Parliament called The Confluence of the Two Seas and said a strong India is in Japan's interest and a strong Japan is in India's interest. He contributed his policy paper, Asia's Democratic Security Diamond, in December 2012, just before he returned to power. As he emphasized in that essay, he promoted cooperation among the US, Australia, India, and Japan as a quad during his second term. Indian Prime Minister Modi must have felt he had no choice but to respond to Abe's love call, while basically maintaining India's self-reliance.
So it's a Japanese love call then. Professor Hirose?
Yes, I'd like a few words about Japan-India relations outside the political sphere. In terms of economic growth, India with its young population and Japan with its super-aged society are in a complementary relationship. If Japan's knowledge and experience of rapid growth are put in use in India, it will be a win-win relationship. Japan and India also had a relationship of mutual support in times of trouble. For example, after the World War II, in order to cheer up the children of Japan who had lost their energy or smiles, Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru sent them a gift of an elephant named Indira after his daughter. Conversely, when India ran short of the foreign currency in the early 1990s, Japan repaid the favor by providing a large amount of aid.
Professor Hirose, I understand you have some slides to show us that illustrate the nexus of India's relationships in various geopolitical connections.
Yes. India now holds a casting vote that determines where the world is headed. I'd like to focus on the two international groups to which India belongs. One is a group of democracies like United States and Japan. This group is located in the Indo-Pacific region, and it values international rules. While these countries value ideals such as human rights and the rule of law, they are also vulnerable to the unexpected loss of their leaders in elections. The other group is, on the contrary, a group of authoritarian countries where strong leaders such as Xi Jinping of China or Vladimir Putin of Russia are in power for a long time. That one is on land, Eurasian continent, a world dominated by history or land-based reality on the trade, rather than ideals. I think it's important to see to which group India belongs more, because the world is becoming unstable. And it is also important to note that the world economy is no longer led by the group of developed countries known as G7. It is led by the emerging economies, including SCO, BRICS, and the nations from Global South. India looks at the world from the bird's eye view, belonging both of the group at the same time. It holds a key in determining creating the majority in whether the world will move toward realism or idealism.
India really does seem uniquely positioned between groups of friends and rivals, between East and West, between democracies and authoritarian countries. And I like this idea of India as the casting vote. Dr. Kiyota, what do you think of this idea?
Yes, I agree with the idea of India holding the casting vote of the world. India's successive governments have been stubbornly followed self-reliance, formerly known as non-alignment, as its core of foreign policy. Having learned the hard lessons of being historically dominated by Islamic powers and European powers, India strives to avoid being dominated by other countries through diplomatic independence. However, self-reliance does not mean isolationism, but rather getting along with all nations. India is idealistically deepening its friendship with all nations, while at the same time pragmatically trying to guide the world in a way that is firmly in line with its own national interest.
And India does seem, often quite self-consciously to put itself in a position, of prominence in what's called, by some the global South. Isn't that right, Professor Hirose?
Yes, one more thing, India has begun to assert its position as a leader of global South. For India, it is a security issue if the neighboring countries, such as Sri Lanka or Pakistan, are threatened by the death trap of China. India does not yet have the economic strength to engage in the kind of money politics that China does. So it is taking on the role of speaking out on behalf of the countries that are suffering. India, which has been a colony of the developed world, can speak as a leader on issues that cannot be solved by the developed world alone, such as the spread of the infectious diseases, climate change, and terrorism, or issues that may have their origins in the developed world.
And of course, India's own security, as well as the India-Japan relationship, is very much determined by and part of this other nexus of relationships. One important relationship for India is India-China. Could you tell us a little bit, Dr. Kiyota, about what is the current state of the India-China relationship and maybe where you see it going?
Relationship between the two major powers, India and China, is very interesting. Although they are geopolitical rivals, they cooperate in situations where they can, such as SCOs and BRICS. However, we must remember that anti-Chinese sentiment has been quite strong in India due to border issues and trade imbalances, especially the standoff between the two armies at Dokram in 2017 and the fistfight clash in 2020, which resulted in casualties, have considerably worsened India-China relations. Although the normalization of relations have progressed after the India-China summit meeting, which was held in Russia in October 2024, the bilateral relations still remain strained. So I'm sure that the future India-China relations will also be key to India's balance between the West and Russia.
Certainly, the United States, speaking of balance, looks to India as a potential balance against China in Asia, has courted India. You mentioned the love call by Japan. There have been love calls by the United States towards India. So, Professor Hirose, I know that, both as a professor and before as a journalist, you looked closely at how India has responded to this courting by the U.S. amid the kind of U.S.-China rivalry. How do you see that going now?
Yes, for the U.S., having the base of a friendly country in the center of Eurasia on the other side of the globe has a very significant geopolitical meaning. And this was made clear by, at the time of the attack of the September 11th, 2001, needing India's cooperation to carry out attacks against Islamic extremism, the U.S. suspended sanctions against India, which had been isolated for its nuclear tests, and helped India rejoin to the international community as a nuclear power. Leaders of the various countries began to follow the U.S. By conducting a diplomatic visit to India, and also Japan followed the U.S. in lifting sanctions on nuclear testing and signing the Atomic Energy Cooperation Agreement. This was, of course, meant to check and contain Russia and China, but it was also meant to tap into the economic growth of Asia. Many of the top executives in the IT industry, which support the U.S. economy, are of Indian descent, And also in the political field, former Republican U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, and the Democratic Vice President Kamala Harris, all of whom are Indian descent. The network of the numerous non-resident Indians is a strong force in overcoming difficult diplomatic issues.
And Dr. Kiyota, the India-Japan or India-US partnership makes so much sense on paper in so many ways, and yet sometimes it feels like the romance is on again, off again. How do you see the relationship?
Yeah, so as Professor Hirose mentioned, the recent progress in India and the US relations is remarkable. Just like between Japan and India, the US and India also have deepened security cooperation, including military exercises such as Malabar, arms deals, and defense dialogues. At the same time, however, we should also understand the distrust that India has toward the United States. Many of my Indian friends still think the US has always betrayed India when India needs help, and the US supplied Pakistan with arms to be used against India, and it sent the 7th Fleet, naval fleet, to the Bay of Bengal to put pressure on India during the third Indo-Pac War in 1971. So even young college students, even recently told me that Russia is more reliable than the US because Russia, Soviet Union has been supportive to India. So recently, the US has been placing more importance on India and treating India as a major power. So India, New Delhi can finally move forward in its relations with Washington on an equal footing. That's a good way.
And now, of course, we have the second Trump administration in Washington, which, of course, very hawkish on China, has every reason to want to, deepen the relationship with India, you would think, but also, a lot of wild cards being played now out of Washington. How do you see that the Trump factor affecting things, either kind of broadly, strategically, or on the personal level, for example, between the president and Prime Minister Modi?
Yes, it's really interesting to see, how the two countries, relations going well under, two leaders. But I think Mr. Trump and Mr. Modi get along well as they did in the first Trump administration. I guess, both emphasize strong leadership and want to revive their countries as superpowers. And Prime Minister Modi visited the US immediately after Prime Minister Ishiba's visit, which is a good start. And nevertheless, the deportation of Indians, illegal migrants from the US immediately after his inauguration could have worsened relations between India and the United States. Both Prime Minister Modi and Foreign Minister Jaishankar tried to understand that, but as expected, they were criticized by the opposition. So we have to be, careful to watch the relations.
And of course, if something changes there, it inevitably has knock-on effects with India's other relationships, including the India-Japan relationship. What sort of scenarios do you see for things between New Delhi and Washington affecting the relationship between New Delhi and Tokyo?
Well, the US-India relations has been one of the very important factors of Japan-India relations. To begin with, there are still many constitutional restrictions for Japan to promote cooperation with other countries in the area of security. Japan's self-defense forces cannot do more with other militaries than it can with its ally, the United States. Moreover, India is not an easy country to deal with. It is quite tough for Japanese to negotiate with Indians. It is often easier to work with the US, which has already cooperated with India in various field frameworks, to get involved with India rather than separately. So that is why the former Prime Minister Abe emphasized the importance of Quad, not only bilateral security cooperation with India. However, it seems to me that the US and even Australia have been tired of dealing with India because its self-reliance, strong foreign policy. Therefore, Quad is kind of, stagnating in my view. So we need another strong Japanese leader who can manage the relations with India and revive the Quad. That's what I think.
So if that's the goal, how does Japan get there? What is the key to maintaining and improving relationships with India?
Well, I once contributed as an essay titled 5 Tips on How to Deal with Indian People, to a Japanese think tank. First, India should be treated as major power. Recently, India is, becoming a real major power. And everyone is pampering India. But in the past, Japanese people sometimes looked down on India and hurt the Indian people's pride. So we should be careful. Secondly, do not try to force India to join our side, right? As we already mentioned about the Indian self-reliance, we must respect that. Third, as mentioned earlier, do not depend on the US for the relationship with India. And fourth, strengthen bilateral relations between Japan and India rather than the Quad. And last, the last is that we should not place too much trust or expectation on India, I'm afraid. India has to be controlled. When we push India hard, India resists harder. So we must learn more about the Indian way of thinking if we want to get something from India. That's my idea.
And do you have any specific advice for Japanese people or anyone who wants to understand India better?
Well, of course, first step is visit to India. I lived there for 5 years and had many discussions with my Indian friends. Yet I'm often surprised by their thinking process. In order to share such experiences, I am currently teaching a course called Introduction to India for first-year university students at the Nagasaki University. This year, I'm planning to open a course called Introduction to Fieldwork in India and conduct a training program in India. I really hope that Japanese people will be exposed to the Indian way of thinking from the young age, which will further strengthen India-Japan relations in the future.
And Professor Hirose, you've spent your career both as a journalist and in academia studying India. What is the secret to coming to grips with such a diverse country?
Yes, I'd like to focus on the Buddhist connection that goes back through the ages. It was an Indian priest who performed the eye-opening ceremony at the Todaishi Temple in Nara, and the Prime Minister Modi visited the Buddhist temple in Kyoto during his first visit to Japan. This kind of deep spiritual bond is not easy to build with other countries. And recently, Japanese animation has been very popular in India, and the Indian movie RRR was a big hit in Japan. What I would like to focus on here is not simply the acceptance of the foreign culture, but the fact that both people share unique worldview that is not found in the monotheistic countries. This can be glimpsed in their movies and anime productions. I think a deep cultural connection is important.
I think anyone who wants to understand what great things the Japan-India relationship can produce should watch the animated Ramayana movie made by Japan and India as a co-production in the early 90s. It's beautiful. Now we're running out of time, so I want to give both of you a chance to give us some final insights and wisdom, maybe take us forward looking at the future of the relationship. Professor Kiyota, can we start with you?
As we have discussed, the relationship between India and Japan has changed dramatically over the past 2 decades. I'd like to emphasize again that Japan must strengthen its relationship with India further because India's importance in the world will only increase in the next 2 decades. So in this context, I'd like to thank again for giving us such a wonderful opportunity to discuss India. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And Professor Hirose?
Yes, indeed, uncertain, unstable, and unpredictable terms. Once again, it heard that the relations between India and Japan is not just a bilateral relationship, but an important one that will determine the direction of the world. I think it was a very good meaningful talk today. Thanks to Dr. Kiyota and Jonathan.
And thank you, and thanks everyone for watching. On behalf of my co-host, Professor Hirose Hiromi from Kindai University, and our special guest, Dr. Kiyota Tomoko from Nagasaki University, I want to thank you for your time. I hope you learned something, and we will see you next time.